Tell me, human, why should the mighty Zavaris Empire lower itself to negotiate with your fragile kind? Admiral Jorah's voice oozed disdain, his iridescent eyes narrowing as he leaned back on his towering, crystalline throne. Major Richard Kane met the alien's glare with unwavering steel, the faintest trace of a smirk tugging at his lips. Clad in a tailored black uniform adorned only with a minimal Earth insignia, he radiated calm confidence, as though utterly unbothered by the dozens of armed soldiers flanking the Grand Hall. Perhaps because the fragility you speak of hides teeth far sharper than you're prepared to face, Kane replied evenly. The grand negotiation chamber was a marvel of alien engineering. Towering obsidian pillars encased in pulsating energy conduits, while bioluminescent organisms floated in midair, casting a dim, otherworldly glow. Despite the grandeur, it carried an unmistakable hostility. Kane felt it in the positioning of the soldiers, the way their weapons were angled ever so slightly toward him, and in the bitter tang of ammonia-heavy air that scratched at his lungs. Admiral Jorah chuckled, his rich voice resonating through the chamber. Bravado suits you, human, but the truth is clear. You are here because Earth's survival hinges on our mercy. He gestured lazily, an assistant stepping forward to place holographic star maps of contested regions onto the table. Relinquish your border claims. Kneel, and the Empire may permit your species to exist as a servile race. Defiance, well, we know how that ends. Kane leaned forward, his sharp gray eyes scanning the map but lingering on the reflection of Jorah's troops standing rigidly behind him. His voice remained level, but the edges cut like a blade. Peace is what I offer, not submission. Reject it, and the consequences may surprise you, Admiral. The room fell silent, heavy with the unspoken challenge. Jorah's expression shifted, his mirth evaporating. The Admiral stood, his imposing, glittering form towering over Kane, like a predator casting its shadow over prey. "Enough games," he hissed, a four-fingered hand curling into a fist. "Arrest him. Let the galaxy know what becomes of insolent species who dare challenge the Zavaris Empire." The tension snapped like a tripwire. The Zavarian soldiers surged forward. Kane moved instantly, discarding any pretense of diplomacy. As the first soldier lunged, Kane sidestepped with calculated precision, gripping the creature's wrist and twisting hard. Bones snapped audibly, and the alien's energy blade clattered uselessly to the floor. Kane grabbed the weapon mid-fall, using its momentum to disable another guard with the searing arc across its torso. Shock rippled through the assembly. Kane's movements were honed and deliberate, every action reflecting years of battlefield experience. But as more guards flooded the room, even his skill couldn't change the numbers against him. Realizing this, he retreated in fluid strides, evading with the tactical awareness of someone who had long ceased to rely on brute force. A hiss from behind warned him of an incoming strike. Spinning, Kane drove his elbow into the attacker's jaw, neutralizing the threat before dashing toward the vaulted exit at the chamber's far end. As he sprinted, sharp clacks of pursuing boots echoed behind him, and the glowing alarm sirens turned the walls a sinister crimson. Through winding halls, Kane maneuvered swiftly, the Citadel's oppressive architecture narrowing his options. His breaths were measured, his mind a calculated storm, evaluating every angle. He had studied layouts like this 100 times in his training. Alien designs differed, but inefficiencies always lingered. It didn't take long before he found an outcropping, a sharp bend in the hall. Pressing himself to the corner's blind spot, he retrieved a slim beacon hidden in his belt and activated it with a soft click. The communicator's ping was brief but steady, A silent message beamed to a human reconnaissance ship cloaked in the void outside the planet's atmosphere. Extraction was now in motion, but he wasn't about to wait passively for rescue. Footsteps thundered closer, alien voices barking orders in an incomprehensible tongue. A wry smile crossed Kane's face. "I gave them a choice," he murmured to himself. As the first group of soldiers rushed around the corner, Kane was already crouched, the stolen energy blade slicing upwards into an unarmored segment of the lead alien's abdomen. A second guard swung wildly, missing entirely as Kane countered with a sharp kick to its knee, sending it crumpling to the ground. The final alien hesitated, fear flashing across its face, before Kane dispatched it with surgical efficiency. For a fleeting moment the hall was quiet once more, Kane's steady breathing the only sound. But the reprieve was short-lived. A distant roar signaled reinforcements. Dozens, maybe more, were mobilizing now, converging toward his last known position. Worse still, barriers descended across branching pathways, boxing him in like prey in a maze. He knew their intent was to force him into a dead end and capture him alive. Unfortunately for the Zavarians, Kane was no ordinary prey. Stepping over the fallen soldiers, Kane inspected the nearest weapon, a primitive Zavarian plasma rifle. With a critical eye, he adjusted its energy settings and power modulation to suit his precision-based needs. When he spoke, his voice was an icy whisper. "You ambushed the wrong diplomat." Turning his focus forward, Kane scanned the dim corridor ahead. His mind calculated trajectories, potential ambush sites and cover points. He didn't need to escape, not yet. First, he'd thin their numbers, instill doubt. They wouldn't just chase him anymore, they'd fear him. As the alien forces closed in, Kane took a deep breath and steadied his grip on the rifle. For the first time since he'd entered this hostile negotiation, his lips curled into an actual smile, one born not of humor, but of resolve. The predator had arrived. "Close the gates, seal every passage. He won't escape." The alien officer's voice echoed through the labyrinthine corridors of the Zavarian stronghold. Major Richard Kane crouched behind a dense alloy column, listening to the clamor of boots and barking commands reverberating through the halls. His sharp gaze traced the branching pathways ahead, mapping out the enemy's approach in his mind. Every second mattered now. The aliens thought they had cornered a lost diplomat, a hapless creature caught in their trap. Kane smiled grimly, the stolen plasma rifle resting easily against his shoulder. He was no one's prey. A flicker of movement appeared in the dim corridor ahead, a vanguard unit of Zavarian enforcers. Kane counted 6, their formations disciplined but predictable. Their posture betrayed their overconfidence, their weapons scanning the area haphazardly as if expecting a helpless target. Kane waited, his finger steady on the trigger. The group moved closer, their alien physiology casting exaggerated shadows under the faint red emergency lights. He let them advance just far enough, their clustered movements making them easy prey. He squeezed the trigger. A single plasma burst struck the point soldier, searing through its chest and splattering the wall behind it in a violent burst of light. The group reacted instantly, shouts erupting as they sought cover. Too late. Kane was already moving. In one fluid motion he shifted positions, using the chaos to fire 3 more precise shots, each finding its mark. 2 fell before they could return fire, while the third's weapon exploded in its hands as Kane's shot struck its power source. The remaining aliens scrambled to regroup, barking panicked commands in their guttural language. Kane darted to a better vantage point, his silent movements ensuring the disoriented squad didn't notice him. With calculated patience, he waited for one to poke its head from cover. When it did, a single shot dropped it instantly. The last two turned to flee, their once arrogant confidence shattered. Kane lowered the rifle slightly, watching them retreat. A flicker of instinct told him to let them go. Fear would spread faster than his plasma rifle ever could. As silence settled over the hallway, Kane scanned the fallen aliens with clinical efficiency, gathering ammunition and tools from their lifeless forms. Every piece of Zavarian technology he collected brought him closer to leveling the playing field. More footsteps in the distance pulled his attention. This time, the rhythm was heavier. Armored reinforcements. They were learning, adapting, sending their elite to flush him out. Good, Kane thought. It would only make the victory sweeter. A booming voice carried down the corridor, resonating with an unnerving calm. Human, surrender, and we may yet show mercy. Kane smirked. The arrogance never seemed to wear off. He leaned against a nearby wall, deliberately exposing part of his silhouette to the approaching soldiers. Predictably, plasma bolts erupted toward him in an instant, the overzealous aliens giving away their positions. He waited until they drew closer, then slipped around a corner and into the shadows. Through a narrow access shaft, Kane maneuvered deeper into the structure. He wasn't just escaping anymore, he was hunting. The inner chambers of the Citadel were a maze of conduits and high-energy cells, the temperature rising as he descended. Kane moved with practiced precision, using the low hum of machinery to mask his steps. The occasional faint reflection in polished surfaces revealed small patrols, but he avoided them with ease. These smaller units weren't worth the effort. His sights were set on a much larger prize. At a distance, the unmistakable hum of power generators drew his attention. Through a grated viewport, Kane observed the heart of the Zavarian operation. A massive energy reactor, its blue core pulsing like a living organism.
Kane's mind raced as he studied the scene. The guards stationed around it were more numerous, heavily armored, and methodical in their patrols. Destroying the reactor could cripple their command infrastructure, but it wasn't just about destruction. Kane needed the Zavarians to feel his presence as more than a disruptive anomaly. They needed to believe he was inevitable, unstoppable. Locating a concealed control terminal near the edge of the reactor chamber, Kane went to work. His knowledge of Zavarian systems was rudimentary but enough to cause trouble. As his fingers danced across the unfamiliar interface, alarms blared to life. Lights flickered erratically, emergency protocols overriding the usual security measures. The guards scrambled in confusion, their disciplined formations unraveling as Kane's diversion took hold. One by one, security barriers throughout the compound began to drop, clearing paths that had been sealed moments earlier. He watched the pandemonium with grim satisfaction before retreating into the chaos he had created. Moving swiftly through newly accessible corridors, Kane turned his attention to thinning the reinforcements. He worked methodically, striking small groups and retreating before larger forces could pin him down. By the time the Zavarians realized the extent of his guerrilla tactics, their casualty list was already mounting. The element of fear was palpable now. Even in their alien tongues, Kane could hear it in the hurried orders, the uncertainty in their movements. To them, he had become a shadow, a force they couldn't track, let alone stop. Somewhere amidst the confusion, a lone Zavarian lieutenant, his armor splattered with burns and panic in his eyes, broadcast a desperate transmission. "He's picking us apart. We need reinforcements. No, evacuate the upper levels immediately." Kane heard it through a stolen comm device and allowed himself a rare chuckle. He wasn't hunting for survival anymore. He was dismantling an empire's pride, one calculated strike at a time. As he reached a secure vantage point overlooking the central command station, he steadied his rifle, adjusting the sights. In his crosshairs stood Admiral Jorah, flanked by trembling officers, still trying to project authority over a situation rapidly spiraling out of control. Kane's finger hovered over the trigger for a moment before he lowered the weapon. Not yet, he thought. Fear was a better weapon than bullets, and the Admiral wasn't ready to break. He retreated silently into the shadows, the chaos he had sown spreading behind him like wildfire. The hunt was far from over, but the Xaverians now understood one undeniable truth: Kane was not their prey. He was their executioner, and the final blow had yet to fall. "He's unstoppable! Pull back to the command ship." Admiral Jorah's command cut through the confusion, his once imposing voice edged with unmasked desperation. Around him, what remained of the elite Xaverian troops scrambled for safety, abandoning their defensive positions in the inner stronghold. Major Kane watched from a concealed vent, his sharp eyes noting every sign of fear that had rippled through the alien ranks. Their arrogant fortress had become a prison, their discipline fragmented under relentless pressure. It was time to bring this to its brutal end. As the Xaverian retreat funneled toward a fortified hangar, Kane moved with lethal intent. His movements were fluid, calculated, each step masked by the ever-present drone of the reactor that powered the failing stronghold. The stolen plasma rifle felt light in his hands now, an extension of his will. The path to the hangar was crawling with guards, hastily thrown into position to cover the retreat. Kane wasn't deterred. Dropping into a shadowed corner of the corridor, he planted a remote explosive onto a conduit. A sharp beep confirmed its activation before he faded back into the dark. The blast came seconds later, erupting in a bright, concussive wave that collapsed the passage ahead. Cries of alarm echoed as several guards were caught in the explosion's fury, and panic spread further. Using the diversion, Kane advanced on the rear flank, dispatching stragglers with silent efficiency. Each shot found its target, each movement bringing him closer to the crux of the operation. The massive hangar doors loomed ahead, now fully visible. Beyond them, a sleek Xaverian command ship idled on the platform, its engines beginning their startup sequence. Admiral Jorah and a cohort of high-ranking officers rushed toward the vessel, flanked by a final line of bodyguards. Kane crouched just outside the hangar, his narrowed eyes surveying the scene. The high ground would give him an advantage here, and a nearby elevated control booth offered the perfect perch. Climbing swiftly, he settled into position, his rifle trained on the crowd below. Through the scope, he could see Jorah clearly now, the once imposing admiral reduced to a frantic figure yelling orders, his golden armor tarnished by soot and his movements heavy with stress. Kane slowed his breathing, steadying his aim as the crosshairs hovered over the alien's broad chest. A single shot would end it all. But Kane hesitated. Killing Jorah was expected, predictable. The Admiral's death would certainly cripple Xaverian morale, but Kane wasn't here for simplicity. He was here to send a message, one the galaxy would remember. Instead, Kane aimed for the command ship's rear engine. A precise shot lanced through the air, striking the core mechanism in a burst of energy. The resulting explosion engulfed the entire rear section of the ship, sending alien officers diving for cover as the vessel groaned under the damage. Chaos reigned in the hangar. Guards scattered, their formation crumbling as Kane exploited the disorder. From his elevated position, he picked them off systematically, each shot calculated, every movement coldly efficient. He left no room for retaliation, no chance for recovery. The Xaverian forces were utterly overwhelmed. Admiral Jorah, now exposed, stumbled away from the smoking remains of his ship. His once loyal bodyguards abandoned him, their weapons discarded in terror. Kane saw the cracks in his enemy's resolve, desperation writ large on Jorah's face. As Kane descended from his perch, the Admiral turned, eyes wide as the human sniper emerged from the shadows. The once diplomat now stood tall, his figure imposing against the backdrop of carnage. "Who? What are you?" Jorah stammered, his voice barely audible over the alarms and distant screams. Kane didn't answer immediately. He raised his rifle, leveling it at the alien leader's head, but then lowered it deliberately. Instead, he took a few steps closer, his voice low and lethal. "You thought you could break humanity. You thought wrong." With a swift motion, Kane activated another remote detonator, placed during his advance. The walls of the hangar trembled as secondary explosions rippled through the facility, the destruction roaring like an uncontrollable inferno. Jorah fell to his knees, his golden armor reflecting the fiery glow. Kane turned, walking away as the Admiral screamed behind him, his words lost in the chaos. The hangar imploded moments later, its reinforced walls crumbling under the onslaught. Kane didn't look back. Exiting the stronghold's perimeter, Kane contacted the human fleet waiting in orbit. Target neutralized. Extraction requested. His tone was calm, almost detached, as if the devastation left behind were nothing more than another mission crossed off the list. The shuttle arrived minutes later, its engines whirring as it hovered just above the war-scarred ground. Kane stepped aboard, his rifle slung over his shoulder, his expression unreadable. The pilot glanced back at him, nervous curiosity evident in their brief exchange. "Did they suffer?" the pilot asked cautiously. Kane gave a faint, humorless smile. "They always do." As the shuttle ascended toward the stars, the fires of the Zavarian stronghold burned brighter, a beacon of warning to the galaxy. Kane leaned back in his seat, the weight of his actions settling in his mind. He hadn't just dismantled a military base, he had shattered the illusion of Zavarian superiority. The universe had underestimated humans for too long. Today was the first step in correcting that mistake.